Hey, Greg Gunn here. You might recognize my voice from the Future podcast, which, if you aren't already, you should totally be listening to. Look for one of those little flyout links in the top right corner. Okay, so a while back, our friend Leo made this wonderful typography video for us. It's an animation of 10 graphic design rules to help improve your typography. And with over 1 million views, I'd say it's done pretty well. But what's really impressive about it is the way Leo showed how those rules work using motion design. We asked how he made it, and he was gracious enough to show us. So with his permission and my narration, here's how Leo built the animated typography manual. Here we are in Adobe After Effects, where all the magic happens. Leo's going to show us how he built the first animation from the video. And here's what that looks like for reference. We see the 0 and the 1 form, then the camera moves through the 0. And as it moves, we start to see a paragraph of text come into focus. When the camera rests, we see that right justified text change and move across the screen to become left justified. Looks easy enough, but let's see how Leo does it. To start, we're going to create a new composition. And since this is the first typography rule, we'll name it 01 and set its resolution to 1920 by 1080. Okay, now let's set the frame rate to 25 frames per second, the duration to 5 seconds, and the background color to black. We'll hit OK, and that will create the composition for us. Now, let's make our type. We'll start by using the text tool to create the 0. We can scale it up by dragging one of the corners, but just like in other Adobe apps, you can fine-tune your type by going to Window, Characters, and opening the Character menu. And by doing so, we can see that Leo is using Helvetica Neue for this demo. Now he's going to show us how to reveal the 0, as if it's drawing itself onto the screen. We'll start by clicking the pen tool, but make sure that we don't have any layer selected. This will create a new shape layer. We can then use the pen tool to kind of trace the contour of the 0. It works the same way as it does in Adobe Illustrator. Now, the goal here is to create a mask that we can then animate to reveal the 0. But we need to make sure that it completely covers it. And to do that, we'll go back to the selection tool, click on the curve, and increase the stroke width. There, now it's covering the full thickness of the 0. To animate that reveal, we'll need to add a path animation. So let's select Shape Layer 1, twirl down the layer properties, and then click the Add button to add a Trim Paths property to the layer. This allows us to animate the start and end positions of the stroke we just made. If we change the start value, you can see that the stroke is trimmed. Okay, now let's click the stopwatch icon next to end to set a keyframe for that property. We'll then drag that keyframe down the timeline to about 1 second. Let's make sure our playhead is at the beginning of the timeline, and we'll change the value of end to be 0%. And this will automatically create another keyframe for us. Cool, so now we can preview our animation. We see the red stroke starts as nothing and then draws itself over the 0. Great. Now let's make sure our edges of the stroke are vertically straight. We'll press Command-R or Control-R on PC to show the rulers, and then drag a guide out to help us align things. Next, we'll adjust our anchor point tangents to try and straighten things out a bit. It's okay if the red stroke itself looks kind of weird, so long as it completely covers the 0. Now that we've straightened the edges out, let's smooth out the timing by adding some easing. We'll select the 2 keyframes and then press F9 to add Easy Ease. And we can see what that did by opening the graph editor and making sure the speed graph is selected. Now, when we play the animation, you can see that it starts slow, then speeds up toward the middle, and then slows down again at the end. But let's finesse that and make it a bit more dramatic. We'll select the 2 keyframes in the graph editor and then adjust the tangents to make the curve more steep, which in turn will make the animation more exaggerated. We can then shorten the time it takes for the animation to finish by dragging the second keyframe back in the timeline to around 10 frames. Okay, now we want to do the same thing on the other side. So let's make a copy of our layer by selecting it and pressing Command D or Control D on PC to duplicate it. On that duplicate layer, we'll right click, go to Transform, and then select Flip Horizontal. Now we have a mirrored layer of our animation that we can line up to cover the other side. But we want this side to start from the bottom. So let's go back into Transform and this time choose Flip Vertical. We'll reposition it to make sure the 0 is entirely covered. There, perfect. We're going to use this animation as a mask to reveal the underlying 0. And to do that, we need to first pre-comp our two animation layers. So let's select Shape Layer 1 and Shape Layer 2, right click and choose Pre-Compose. And we'll name it something obvious like 0 Reveal Animation. Then click OK to create the new comp. Cool, now our animation is all in one layer and we can use it as a mask. We'll first select our underlying text layer, then we need to make sure that the Track Matte column is visible in the timeline. And if it's not, we can click the Toggle Switches button at the bottom to show it. Okay, under Track Matte, we'll click the drop-down menu on the 0 layer and choose Alpha Matte. That tells this layer to use the layer above it as a mask. And when we play our animation back, we now see that the 0 is revealed by the mask, which makes it look like it draws itself on the screen. Pretty cool. Track mattes are a great tool for animations like this, where you want to have one layer reveal another. Okay, now let's animate the other numeral. So we'll duplicate the 0 layer, double click to edit, and change it to a 1. And then let's move that to the right to reflect the design. And before we start, let's look at the animation again for reference. We see the 1 is formed from a rectangle sliding in from right to left, and its serif flies out from behind it. Okay, so let's see how Leo does this. We'll start by right-clicking on the 1 layer and choosing Create Shapes from Text. This makes a new shape layer with a path that matches your text. Now, we don't need the original text layer, so let's delete that. We've got our 1 as a shape layer now, but to match the animation reference, we need to break it into 2 parts. And to do that, let's duplicate the layer and we'll name the top serif part Head and the bottom part Stem. Done. Let's start with the stem. And to stay focused, we'll solo that layer by clicking the circle icon next to the eye symbol in the Layers panel. To edit this shape, we're going to switch to the pen tool options and then look for the Delete Vertex tool. We can then remove a couple of points to simplify the shape. We'll then twirl down the layer properties a few steps until we see a property named Path. Make sure the playhead is at the beginning of the timeline, and then let's click the stopwatch next to Path to set a new keyframe. And for now, we'll move that key to frame 15. With our playhead still at the start, we'll select the 2 points on the right side of the shape and drag them to the right and off screen. This will automatically create a new keyframe where our playhead is. And for now, we're going to move this new keyframe in the middle, around frame 9. Next, we're going to make a third keyframe by selecting the points on the left side of the shape and moving them off screen too. Okay, so now we have 3 keyframes to work with. And if we preview the animation, we see that the shape sort of stretches into position, but it needs some timing refinement. And it should also be a rectangle. So let's get rid of that little angle at the top. With our playhead at the first keyframe, we'll select the top left point. But when we move it, the shape curves because it's a Bezier point. So let's go back to the pen tool, and this time choose the Convert Vertex tool. We'll then click the point to remove the Bezier and straighten it out. And with a little nudging, we've now got a rectangle. Now let's do the same for the second keyframe to make sure it remains a rectangle while it's in transition. Looks good. Now let's work on the timing. We'll first select all 3 keyframes and press F9 again to add easy ease. We'll then open the graph editor and start to move things around a bit. So let's do the same thing we did for the 0 by selecting all the keyframes and dragging their tangents to make steeper curves. And now when we play it back, we can see that the animation is much snappier. but there's a dip in movement during the middle, so let's smooth that out. We'll select the 2 middle points and drag them up in the speed graph. There we go, much smoother. Okay, now let's animate the serif. We'll make sure that the layer is visible by clicking the solo button, and now we can see the entire numeral. And just like the stem, we need to modify this shape so that it's only the serif we're working with. So let's move our playhead to the middle keyframe so we can see the rectangle. We'll select the bottom 2 points and then move them up to align with the serif. Next, we'll press P to twirl down the position property of our selected layer. And let's set a position keyframe by hitting the stopwatch. Now let's move that keyframe down to around frame 15, where the stem animation ends. Okay, let's move our playhead up to around frame 8, select our serif, and move it to the right, hiding it within the rectangle. This creates the illusion of the serif appearing from behind it. And since we only need to show the serif toward the end of the rectangle animation, we can trim the first part of that layer and have it start at that first keyframe. To smooth out the timing, let's select these keys, hit F9, and add easy ease to them. And then lastly, we'll open the graph editor, and this time we'll only drag the right point so that the animation starts quickly but then finishes slowly, easing out and into its resting position. Nice and smooth. Now let's move on to the next part of the sequence. In the original animation, we see that after the 0 and the 1 appear, the camera moves through them to find a paragraph of text. It starts right justified, but then changes to be left justified. So let's see how Leo achieved that unique effect. Now, there are 2 ways we could approach this. We could type everything out in Illustrator, turn the text into shapes, import them into After Effects, and then animate each word one by one. But that sounds like a lot of work. So let's take the quicker route. We'll start by grabbing the type tool and setting our type right here in After Effects. And quick shout out to redcatmotion.com, which is Leo's animation company. Okay, now we'll duplicate that layer and use it to set our second line of text. Now, before we animate, we need to make sure our justification is correct. In this case, we'll want to start with the text justified right. So we'll go to Window, Paragraph, and with our text layer selected, choose Justify Right. Now we can align our layers on the right side and we're ready to animate. For the sake of time, let's start with one line. We'll twirl down the text layer properties and under Text, look for that Animate button again, the one with a little arrow next to it. From that menu, we'll choose Position. This creates a new range selector property that will let us animate the text within this layer. Next, we'll drag out some guides to help us position and align things. We know we want the text to start justified on the right and then move to be justified on the left. To make that happen, we'll look at our layer properties again, and under Animator 1, Range Selector 1, we'll set a keyframe for Position. We'll then move our playhead down in the timeline to around frame 15. Next, we'll select our text layer again and move it to the left so that it aligns with our guide. And this will be the end position. Great, so we've got it moving right to left. Now let's make it move word by word. Back in our layer properties, we'll look for Range Selector 1, twirl down its properties, and animate the end value. We'll make sure the playhead is in the second position, frame 15, and then we'll set a keyframe of 100%. Now, let's move our playhead back to the start and change the value of end to 0%. So it starts at 0 and then changes to 100% over the course of 15 frames. We can see that the text moves right to left, but now it's moving one letter at a time, which is fun, but we want to move whole words. So under the Range Selector 1 properties, we'll twirl down the advanced settings and change the based on value from characters to words. Now we've got each word moving from right to left. And to smooth things out a little, we'll select the keyframes on position and end, hit F9 again, and give them that easy ease treatment. much better. And the best part is that we can reuse this animation for our second line of text. So let's duplicate this layer and type out our new text. Cool. We'll move that line down beneath the first, and there we go. But the two lines don't line up at the end, so we'll need to adjust the second position keyframe on our new text layer. So let's make sure the playhead is on that keyframe, and then change the position value until it lines up on the left. There we go. And that's essentially how that text animation works. Leo's now going to show us how to take the two animations we've built and move a camera from one to the other. But to do that, we'll need to make a new composition. We'll go to Composition, New Composition, and let's call this one Main Comp. It's where our entire animation will live. We'll also need to make sure that it's long enough to accommodate our camera move. So let's go with 15 seconds. Next, we'll need to bring in our two other compositions, the 0-1 animation and the paragraph animation. So let's drag those two comps in from the Project tab. Cool, now let's make a camera. In the menu, we'll go to Layer, Camera to create a new camera for our scene. Let's make sure the type is set to one node camera and the preset is 35mm. Then we just hit OK and we have ourselves a camera. In order for our layers to be seen by the camera, they need to be 3D. So let's look for the 3D icon in our layer switches. It kind of looks like a small cube. And if it's not there, we can always click the toggle switches button to show it. We'll then click the empty square beneath that cube for each layer to enable 3D. Now, when we switch to two views and move our camera, we see that the text layer moves in 3D space, as if our camera is tracking toward it. Now we may need to switch back and forth between views so that we can see where things are in 3D space. If we solo our 0-1 layer and move the camera close to it, we see that it looks pixelated and low quality, which is not what we want. So let's fix that. To do that, we'll need to check the Collapse Transformation switch on that layer. It's the small icon that resembles the sun. But when we click on it, the 3D effect is lost. If we turn it off again, the 3D effect comes back. So we need to figure out something else. The thing is, when you enable collapse transformations on a composition like our 0-1, it tells the camera to look at each layer inside of that composition and treat them as if they were on this current timeline. But when we open that composition, we see that those layers do not have 3D enabled, which means that's an easy fix. Turn on 3D for each of those layers inside of our 0-1 composition. Now, when we go back to our main comp with the camera, we see that the layers are back in 3D space, and they also remain sharp when we get close to them. Problem solved. And we'll do the same thing for our paragraph composition. Turn collapse transformations on both the comp itself and all of the layers inside of it, while also enabling 3D on each of those layers. It's important to note that collapse transformations works best on vector and text layers. It's designed to keep the resolution intact, but it doesn't work on raster layers like photos or videos. Alright, now both of our animations are in 3D space and they'll keep their vector quality. In our main comp, let's move the paragraph animation back in Z space, away from our camera. And we'll reposition it so that it appears directly behind the 0. Great. Now let's animate our camera. We'll twirl down the layer properties for our camera and set a keyframe for the position, making sure that it's after the 0-1 animation has completed. Next, we'll move our playhead down a few frames and then move our camera in Z space through the 0 until we see the paragraph of text. We want the paragraph of text to look like it's moving through fog and kind of fading into view. So we'll slip the layer down in the timeline and animate its opacity. So with the paragraph layer selected, we'll hit T to show the opacity property, and we'll set two keyframes. The first will be 0%, and the second will be 100%, right when the camera stops. There, now it looks like it's fading in with the camera move. But let's smooth things out. So we'll select our keyframes and press F9 again to add a little bit of easing. We can also adjust the camera's speed in the graph editor to make it a bit more dynamic. Lastly, let's add some depth of field. With our camera layer selected, we'll go to Layer, Camera Settings, and turn on Enable Depth of Field. And let's try an aperture of 15 to start. I think it looks pretty great. When the camera gets close to the 0, it blurs out, creating this really nice cinematic effect. And there we have it, our finished animation. A big thank you to Leo for taking the time to share his animation process with us. I think he did a fantastic job with the video. Look for a link in the description where you can watch the full typography manual animation. It's really good and you'll learn a lot from it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.